Back to the Dean Obeidallah show. Right now, very happy to welcome to the show, coming to us from Germany, Marcel Dirsus, a political scientist, a non-resident fellow at the Institute for Security Policy at Kiel University in Germany, and the author of a very compelling book that actually came out last year, How Tyrants Fall and How Nations Survive. And I'm interested in both. So, Marcel, nice to have you on.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
So the book, very good book. It's a really good read. I learned a lot. A lot of times right now, we keep focusing on things like Mussolini or Hitler, that kind of stuff. But you gave us much more contemporary examples. And a lot of people like in different parts of Europe or Asia that doesn't get a lot of press here. And I found it really compelling. So I want to first talk about tyranny in general that you've wrote about, and then talk about what you're seeing here in the United States now, because this book predates Trump's second term. How would you define for people, like, is there a working definition of what a real tyrant is?
Yeah, political scientists always have a tough time agreeing on anything. It's not exactly physics.
Right.
But so what I'm interested in this book are political systems in which leaders only need a very small share of the population in order to maintain power or to take power. So if you look at a functioning democracy, like the UK, for example, or like Germany or the US, at least up until now, you always need a massive share of the population in order to get power and to maintain it. So in the US, you need millions and millions of voters because you need to win elections.
Right.
And then if you look at a political system like North Korea under Kim Jong-un, he may only need 100 or 200 families in order to maintain that power. And it's really just the top generals and, the top intelligence officials. And that obviously does something to the incentives that these leaders have.
Certainly, and very much true. If you don't care about democracy anymore, you really are free to. It's not that you're not concerned about some constituency, but the constituency is different than the actual voters. It might be that small group of people. I found it interesting in your book, just about different tyrants of the current day, or was these common characteristics I saw, some that are very familiar to me now in America. But I want to touch on a few, like, for example, the idea corruption. How rampant is corruption in these tyranny, dictatorships, where these kind of leaderships are happening?
Oh yeah, I mean, corruption is completely built into these systems. Because if you imagine that you have this very small share of the population that you need to look after, corruption is a great way to keep them on your side without necessarily having to use violence all the time. So if you're somebody like Putin, for example, and money comes in, you don't give it to the people. You don't build a school in Siberia. You don't build a school somewhere in Vladivostok or hospitals or roads. What you do is you take that money, you siphon it off the budget, and you give it to those generals, and you give it to those oligarchs, and you give it to those intelligence officials. It is almost irrational for these people to do something good for their population because their population has a comparatively small influence on whether they maintain power or not. So, these leaders have to govern totally differently than a Joe Biden would have, or a Keir Starmer would have, or a German chancellor would.
Sure. And what about the cult of personality aspect to these leaders in general?
Yeah, I mean, so these people, by and large, are deeply weird. They're not normal in any kind of sense of the word, right? And they would do extremely badly if they worked in a cubicle. If they had an ordinary job with an ordinary boss, they would be terrible. But they are often very well suited for the system in which they operate. So they're narcissists.
Mm-hmm.
They're psychopaths. And that makes sense because these people need to be willing to use violence regularly, even
Mm-hmm.
against the people closest to them. So they might have a normal conversation like you and I just now, and then later on they might order the death of the person that they've just spoken to. So they cannot possibly be normal, but in that system it can make sense to behave that way. So it doesn't necessarily mean that they're irrational, but all of them are cruel, they're narcissists, they're psychopaths.
Yeah, narcissism was a big thing I saw in the people that you described. I imagine the rule of law, I mean, you wrote about it, but you could share, the rule of law is really what they say it is. Like there's no objective rule of law that applies to them. Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, totally. And, some of these people do things that are pretty crazy, at least when you look at it from the outside. So, I mean, in the book, for example, I look at a dictator from Turkmenistan who built a golden statue of himself that rotated around the sun. I look at Muammar Gaddafi, and Muammar Gaddafi once on a trip to Paris, he had 100 cars. He traveled with his all-female Amazonian bodyguard,
Mm-hmm.
and when he said, "Look, I really want to, go on the Seine," what they had to do is they had to close down all the bridges that went across the river purely because that's what Gaddafi wanted to do. So if you imagine that somebody like Muammar Gaddafi can do something like this abroad, imagine the kind of stuff that he gets up to at home. And that's really the problem when you give one person too much power. I'm firmly convinced that humans are not made for that. And the more power you give to these people, the weirder they become and the more catastrophic things become.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, you see with celebrity, often people get famous and then they think they're all powerful because they don't have the apparatus of a government to make things happen. They could just do things, paparazzi, and be demanding and yell at their assistants and throw things at a producer or something like that. But this is different. I also noted in your book, you talked about these tyrants and dictators will appoint people who are loyal, even if incompetent. In fact, incompetence doesn't matter. Can you touch a little bit more on that? Obviously, I'm painting a picture of someone that I'm dealing with right now on U.S. soil, but this just jumped out in your book. So could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so if you go back to that point about the people that you need in order to maintain power, and
Mhm.
you sit in that palace and you think to yourself, okay, who am I going to surround yourself with? Usually, these are not going to be competent people because competent people could overthrow you. And we know that once these leaders are overthrown, they oftentimes don't just lose their power, but also their freedom or even their life. So, when political scientists looked at the fate of personalist dictators, the type of dictators that have most power in their hands, they found that more than two-thirds of them end up in
Mhm.
forced exile, jail, or dead. So at first, it may seem like a nice thing. You can explore a large share of the population if only you look after that small group of people. But very quickly, can become a trap because democratic leaders can afford to lose a lot of supporters and still maintain power. But when these people lose even, 20, 30, 50 generals,
Mhm.
they might be done for. So they don't have an interest in those generals being particularly good at their job.
Yeah, I was really taken by the chapters that you wrote about. I think it's about, you were saying nearly two-thirds or 70% since World War II of these type of leaders. It doesn't end well. Like you don't see them walking around giving speeches and hanging out and cutting ribbons at events like that. They're dead, they're exiled, or they're in prison. And another thing I noted that to control power, and I'm talking about Marcel Dirsus, a political scientist and author of the book How Tyrants Fall and How Nations Survive, that to stay in power, the tyrants don't go to the first thing, mass oppression. It is targeted repression. And can you share what examples are? What is targeted repression? What are some examples of that?
Yeah, so I think, when in democracies we look at these types of regimes, we oftentimes imagine these, omnipotent rulers that can basically do whatever they want
Mhm.
and they have absolutely no constraints. And of course, in many ways, they are powerful. They can disappear people, they can give an order to shoot. So they are different from democratic leaders. But everyone requires some people, and all of them have some constraints. So if you imagine a scenario where you've got people out in the streets protesting against the regime, dictators usually have to react because if they don't, they look weak, and that's something they cannot afford. But if they decide to use violence, then the next day they might even have more people in the streets because usually you don't make yourself popular when you beat down women or children or
Mhm.
pensioners. And then the opposition can force these leaders into something that in German we sometimes call a choice between the plague and cholera. So there are no more good options left. You
Yes.
can't really let the protest go on because, again, that makes you look bad. You can't have that. But if you give an order to shoot, oftentimes regime collapse. And that's so fascinating in a way because you would think that at that point, when the regime points its gun at these unarmed protesters, the regime cannot lose. But reality is often very different. At that point, regimes often collapse under the weight of their own repression because the security forces refuse to fire or because palace elites refuse to go along with it.
It's interesting that, your book, you cite Gene Sharp's book, From Dictatorship to Democracy. And in both of you, because I wrote an article for Substack just about it yesterday. In fact, I cited you in this and that book as well, where people are not aware, I think, often, and you guys make the point that even dictators want at least the illusion of popular support because that gives them power. There's a psychological advantage to the idea that everyone loves this guy. So if you don't, there's something wrong with you. Or they're omnipotent, they're all powerful, so you can't stand up to them. So when that chips away, that's very troubling for them. And that's why people like Putin have elections, even though it's rigged, fully rigged. He wants to be able to be like, I'm the winner. Look, everybody loves me. And that has a psychological and intangible benefit to it.
Yeah, I think there's two elements to that. So the first one is that impression. So you
Mhm.
want that impression of inevitability. And if you can point to these, higher election results and you can say, oh, look, all of these people are supporting me, fewer people are going to protest against you. And the fewer people you protest against you, the less violence you have to use. So you
Sure.
avoid that scenario where things might, you know, go out of control essentially. And the second element, interestingly, in a regime like Russia also, elections are a way to collect information because if you surround yourself with all of these incompetent people that consistently lie to you because they're scared of going to a gulag or, losing your job, you really do detach from reality in your life. You generally don't know what is going on in your country anymore or abroad. So in these situations, somewhat counterintuitively, an election can be a way to learn about the concerns of your own citizens.
That's very interesting. Like, I mean, even though they rigged it, they just wanted to like give me the real results. Like, this is bad or this is good. The I was found a very interesting point that you made in the book too. If you do the big clamp down on people, use the military in the streets, yeah, it could snuff out an opposition. But the other side is it could result in even more of a backlash, even more people animated. I guess it depends on the history of the country. And is that important? Like a country that has a history of democracy and freedoms, and somebody comes in and starts chipping it away, it's in the DNA of the people to stand up more.
Yeah, it's hugely important. So, I mean, there's no country on earth where democracy is God-given, right? I mean,
Right.
the US, American democracy could die, German democracy could die again, British
Right.
democracy could die. So, I think it's important to keep that in mind. But existing democracies do have an advantage because people, the police, the soldiers, the intelligence officials, they were brought up in these norms that tell them not to get involved, to not put one man above the constitution or above the
Mhm.
laws. So in that sense, democracies are a lot more resilient to these types of events than other regimes where maybe you had your last coup a year ago or 2 years ago. And in fact, what we see is that oftentimes when you have that type of instability, you just have it again and again and again. So this is something that we sometimes call a coup trap. If you have one,
Uh,
you're likely to have another and another, and it is something that is very difficult to get out of.
when you look at Vladimir Putin, would you define him as a political scientist as a tyrant?
Absolutely, yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, Russia had a brief spell of democracy, but that is long over.
Mhm.
And we are at this point now. I mean, Vladimir Putin can ignore the vast majority of the population. He still has to be worried about them turning out into the streets because, again, that could lead to his downfall. But the Russian government has expended a lot of time and a lot of resources in making it more difficult for people to go out into those squares. So, ordinarily, one of the things that make nonviolent protest so difficult to deal with is that it has something called a participation advantage. So if I ask you or I ask your listeners to go join a rebellion with me or to plan an assassination of a political leader, they're likely to say no. But if I say, hey, look, you want to come out onto the square, would you be willing to protest? A lot more people would be willing to take that risk.
Sure.
But in Russia now, the cost of that is so high that the participation advantage almost evaporates into thin air because nobody wants to go to a labor camp for 5 years just for protesting even once.
That's interesting. When you look at Viktor Orban in Hungary, who at one point it was appeared to be a robust democracy, and now over the 15 plus years, chipped away at every single thing there. Where does that fall now?
So I guess most political scientists would call that competitive authoritarianism. So
Okay.
you have elements of a democracy, but the elections are not fair. So if you imagine a playing field, it's not level. It's tilted in favor of the regime and of Viktor Orban, but you do still have meaningful elections. So you could still win. It's just more difficult than it would be if the fight were fair. So he's not quite the type of leader that I'd be looking at in the book, but it's moving in that direction.
So in Hungary, the opposition party does win local elections. It's the national election that is so challenging over years. And when you, what is distressing, and I'm sure you're aware of this, the affinity of the American Republican Party to Viktor Orban. And it's like there's the Project 2025 here. It's as if it was written by the Fidesz party in Hungary. I mean, they're really just copying it one after the other on what they're doing. So what let's talk about now America for a little bit. Obviously, Donald Trump is not a tyrant yet in the definition, the real definition of what it is. In my the way I view him, we're really close to tyranny because we've never seen anything like this. It's not over the top to say what we're experiencing with Donald Trump is unlike anything we've seen from an American president, and let alone it's just been in 3 months. I mean, it's deeply alarming. When you look at Trump, just some of the traits you describe with tyrants, what do you see that matches up? I know he's not a tyrant, so we're not saying he's a tyrant, but what matches up and what might ring some alarm bells for you or red flags for you?
Well, yeah, I mean, he's not a tyrant, but I think there's a very good case to be made that he'd like to be one. So the question is, can he get away with it? And what stands between Donald Trump now and Donald Trump the tyrant, Donald Trump the dictator? And I think part of the difficulty in looking at this and analyzing the situation is just the flood of news. So, every hour, even in Germany, we've got, Trump does this, Trump does that. It's very difficult to keep track of. So I think the first point is you got to focus. So, you have to differentiate between things that are disagreeable or that might even be cruel and things that can genuinely help him dismantle American democracy. And I think when it comes to that, there are two things that I'll primarily be worried about. The first is the justice system, because, of course, democracy is going to struggle if you can either ignore the judges or if you can replace them with your own. And then the second thing, and I think this would be even more consequential, is anything to do with the security forces. Because ultimately, court judgments are only good if you can implement them. And whether you can implement them or not is ultimately decided by the men and women with guns. And, I've had this discussion with a couple of American friends, and, some of them have said to me, that's an unrealistic scenario. That's not going to happen. Our military is not going to go along with it. Our police is not going to go along with it. And I hope they don't. But I think this is something to take into consideration. That, in my opinion, would be the absolute worst case.
For what it's worth, Trump just had a meeting yesterday where he's given his Homeland Security and Secretary of Defense 90 days to come up with a plan how to use the military to do policing in America, which is a violation of federal law with very limited exceptions. So they're going to they're still trying to navigate within the legal system while trying to break the legal system. Like, it's kind of unique. They had a 9-0 Supreme Court decision against them on this deportation of a man, Abrego Garcia, to El Salvador. And they're like, we won the case. I'm like, you lost the case. You just can't say you won the case. But now it's going to go through the process of, can they enforce it, the courts? And that's where some of these judges are going to be concerned about having a real constitutional crisis, not knowing where it goes. What about, we're at the 100-day mark for Donald Trump. He's been in for 100 days in America. This is some milestone that the media loves to talk about. It really comes from FDR so long ago, but in any event, we still talk about it. His polling numbers are awful. And even in Fox News, and he lashed out against it. He actually called for a criminal investigation in writing against Fox News, Washington Post, and New York Times. He seems to instinctively understand that being less popular could be an impediment to him. But how important is it that people see this, that they see that he's unpopular, that it's coming, and even among his base, he still has a lot of popularity, but among independents, he's really just dropping the bottom. It's just cratering horribly right now.
Yeah, it's massively important. So, I think Donald Trump is Donald Trump, and it is very difficult to influence him directly. But what you can do is influence the people around him that enable him. So, the tech billionaires and the Republicans, because a lot of these people are sane and they can be swayed because they're rational. So if Republicans think, for example, that they're going to get absolutely crushed at the ballot box for enabling Donald Trump, they will change their calculus and they will try to steer Donald Trump, or they will start, blocking some of Donald Trump's agenda. And it's the same with these billionaires. These people, by and large, don't support Donald Trump because they think he's a great guy. They just want money and they want power. And that, of course, is an opening. And the other thing that I would say, I'm of the mind that Donald Trump's incompetence is perhaps American democracy's best hope. You see almost a mini version of this trap that dictators often fall into when it comes to Trump. He is not very good at the business of governing, and he has surrounded himself with many people who have no idea what they're doing. And the result of them constantly telling him what he wants to hear and enabling him is that he has started to make catastrophic mistakes. And some of them are very difficult to explain away. I mean, if your 401k is dropping and you got to worry about your retirement, that is going to have an impact whether you like the guy or not. So I think, in a way, his lack of competence is a massive chance for the opposition.
Does the fact that I touched on this slightly earlier, but I wanted to ask it point blank here, is that does the fact that in the DNA of Americans, all we know is democracy. All we know is this Constitution through generations, and that Americans have a proud history of fighting for freedom against tyrants, against dictators, and against fascism in other parts of the world. And we don't have a perfect record we've done some bad things. But I'm saying as an American here, this is part of our DNA. Does that make it more difficult for him to get the military to do what he wants, for people to sit back and have their freedoms actually taken away, as opposed to a country that doesn't have an established democracy and constitution for years like we have?
100%. So I don't think it's likely that he'll be able to neutralize the military or be able to capture the military to act against Americans. It's just something that I think we need to keep in mind as a scenario, as a type of worst case, so that all the alarm bells can go off when anything remotely even that in that sphere happens. And I think it's good and bad that you have this history. So I think on balance it's good, but what it does do, I think, is it gives some people the impression that it's inevitable, right? So I think for a lot of these people, it's about, I don't know, owning the libs, or it's about like dunking on people they dislike. And, they don't take it as serious as it could be. Because, of course, at first, the government may come for people that you dislike, but if there's no rule of law, they can also come after you at any moment in time. And the other thing is that this obviously also has a massive impact on people abroad. So, me being German, I grew up in freedom in large part because of the sacrifices that Americans have made. And, as long as I've been thinking about politics, I've admired the US and I've admired Americans. And now, we can no longer be sure what side America actually stands on. And, to us, that's a massive problem. But obviously, if you're Ukrainian, for example, that could quite literally be a question of life and death.
Very interesting that you said that you don't know which side America stands on. And that's a question I've had too, looking at where we are now, that this is all speculative, but if you go back to World War II, if Trump is president, does he side with the Axis power over the Allied powers? Because he seems to have more of a connection to those who are dictators and strongmen as opposed to Western democratic leaders. And I just see his affinity to Putin and always really adversarial now with China. He did admire the leader there, but you have to wonder about that and what that means for the future. If other alliances go forward, he has a natural affinity to dictators and strongmen. It's
Yeah, he does. Yeah, no, he admires them, whether it's Putin or whether it's Kim Jong-un or whether it's Xi Jinping, all of these people that traditionally would have been foes to the United States and, that would be foes to us are almost seen as friends by him. I mean, in a way, it goes beyond allies. This is a man talking about sending love letters to these people. It's completely absurd. And ordinarily, Republicans would punish him for doing that. But evidently, they're calculating that supporting him is in their political interest. Or I believe some of them at this point are probably also worried about the repercussions. And I'm not just talking about political repercussions that they may face if they stop supporting him.
Yeah, Senator Lisa Murkowski, a Republican, recently talked about personal safety concerns, which we've not heard really in American politics like that. The one thing you mentioned, that if Republicans calculate that they're going to lose, maybe they'll back away from Trump. I would tell you the modern Republican Party, their first instinct is how to rig the election legally first. And they see that's not going to work. There's just a handful of Republicans in the House that are really in swing districts who gerrymandering hasn't made it undemocratic, who would really suffer. But instead, we expect them to try to change the election laws, which they're trying right now, to tip the election to their side. Because deep down, the GOP is an autocratic party now. I don't know what it was before. Years and years ago, they may have been rah, rah, America. I saw it. Obviously, I grew up here. Now, to me, if they could end elections and just have their king, sadly, I think that a lot would do that. So last thing, I'm not saying we're going to get to a tyrant in America, but how do tyrants fall? Because that's the name of the book. What is the typical way? I'll have to reach out to you in the future if we're really a tyranny, from maybe a blueprint on what we can do here. But how do tyrants generally fall?
Yeah, I mean, it's a complicated question, but, so people by and large, they want freedom. They don't want tyranny. They want to have a say in the way that they're being governed. So, every tyrant constantly has to be afraid of his own people. And the people that he needs to be most afraid of are the people closest to him. So the advisors, the generals, those intelligence officials that keep them in power. But in fact, you have your best chance of creating a democratization if you can topple tyrants to non-violent means. So mass protests, bringing out people into the streets. And that doesn't just have to be your sort of ordinary protest. You know, as Gene Sharp has written, there are all kinds of things that you can do to bring these regimes to a halt, up to, you know, general strikes, for example, where you can really essentially grind a whole country to a halt. So the variety of things that you can do, I think when it comes to the US in particular, you know, because there are still meaningful elections, the most important thing right now is to mobilize as many people as possible against the government and to try to punish anyone politically and economically that continues to enable Donald Trump.
Well, Marcel, I appreciate it, and I apologize. This interview doesn't allow you to come into America in the future in case someone in the Trump administration sees this. But the book itself, How Tyrants Fall and How Nations Survive, it's a great read. I really appreciate it. And hopefully that, you know, we can talk in the future as things develop, you know, down the road, maybe a few months, and see how Europe's seeing what's going on, where we're going from there. But I really appreciate your time and your insight.
Thank you very much for having me. I hope you have a
Sure.
great